Idolatry, one of the most strongly condemned practices in the Bible. It means giving worship or devotion to anything other than God, whether through carved statues or foreign deities. Israel fell into it repeatedly, from the golden calf at Sinai to the altars raised under later kings, and each time it brought judgment on the nation. Idolatry was treated as betrayal, like turning from a faithful spouse to another lover. In modern times, idols are not usually statues, but things people elevate above God, such as wealth or personal ambitions. These modern idols hold the same danger because they steal devotion away from the Creator. The practice is forbidden because it replaces Him with powerless substitutes that cannot save. Witchcraft, sometimes called sorcery. This is another practice the Bible consistently forbids. It involves using spells or rituals to manipulate spiritual forces. In ancient times, nations around Israel often turned to sorcerers and magicians for guidance or power, but God warned His people not to follow them. King Saul even banned witches from the land to purge Israel of the practice, yet in desperation, he later sought out one himself, exposing the danger of relying on forbidden powers. The danger of witchcraft is that it turns people toward dark spiritual powers instead of God. In the modern world, it surfaces in new forms. Wiccan practices and New Age rituals, or even pop culture's fascination with casting spells or harnessing magic. What seems harmless in entertainment is rooted in the same forbidden pursuit of control apart from God. Divination. This is the attempt to uncover hidden knowledge or predict the future through supernatural means. In the ancient world, this included interpreting omens or consulting oracles. God's people were warned not to copy these practices from surrounding nations because they replaced trust in Him with superstition. Stories in the Bible show diviners and magicians trying to compete with God's prophets, but their power always proved empty. The danger of divination is that it seeks guidance apart from the Creator. In the present day, it continues in the form of tarot cards, palm reading, astrology charts, and psychic hotlines. Even when marketed as harmless fun, it follows the same pattern, turning hearts toward false sources of wisdom that cannot offer true direction. Necromancy, the practice of trying to contact the dead for knowledge or power. The Bible gives a well-known example in the story of King Saul and the Witch of Endor. After God no longer answered his prayers, Saul sought out a medium to call up the prophet Samuel's spirit. The act brought condemnation on him and showed how far he had fallen from obedience. Necromancy was common among surrounding nations, but God's people were told it was an abomination because it opened the door to deception from dark spirits. Even now, the desire to reach loved ones beyond the grave fuels seances and spirit boards that claim to deliver messages from the dead. These attempts are often framed as comforting, but the Bible warns that they cross a boundary that God has firmly closed. Astrology. The Bible forbids turning to the sun, moon, or stars for guidance. In ancient times, nations charted the skies and believed heavenly bodies controlled their fate. Some even bowed down to them as gods. Israel was warned not to follow this path because it replaced the Creator with created things. Prophets later condemned kings and priests who burned incense to the stars, showing how deeply the practice had spread. The issue wasn't just superstition, it was worship given to objects that God made. Today, astrology is still popular through horoscopes and zodiac signs, or other star-based personality charts. What many see as entertainment is tied to the same forbidden search for destiny in the heavens, rather than trusting the one who rules them. Human and child sacrifice. Among the most horrifying practices condemned in the Bible was the sacrifice of children to the pagan god Molech. This often involved placing infants into fire as an offering, something God's people were strictly warned never to imitate. Yet history shows that some kings of Judah allowed it, bringing deep corruption into the nation. The prophets denounced the act as not only cruel, but also a complete rejection of God's covenant. The seriousness of this command is clear. It attacked both life itself and the holiness of God. While the ritual burning of children is not common today, the idea of sacrificing the vulnerable in the pursuit of power or prosperity still echoes in dark spiritual movements and certain occult groups. Temple prostitution. Many ancient religions tied worship to sexual acts, believing they could secure fertility for the land or favor from the gods. This took the form of temple prostitution, where men and women were dedicated to pagan shrines and engaged in ritual sex as part of ceremonies. Israel was directly warned against copying these practices from neighboring nations, because they combined immorality with idolatry. Some kings tolerated or even promoted them, and the prophets condemned the nation for allowing such corruption to flourish in God's land. While the rituals of ancient fertility cults have faded, echoes of them remain in modern pagan revivals and occult groups that connect sexuality with spiritual power. The Bible forbids these rites because they distort worship and exploit human bodies, occult symbols, and charms. Another practice forbidden in the Bible was the use of objects believed to hold magical power. In the ancient world, people wore charms, tied amulets to their clothing, or placed symbols in their homes to ward off harm or attract blessings. Prophets condemned these acts because they relied on superstition instead of God's protection. Some women in Israel even sewed charms into their garments as part of hidden rituals, which drew sharp rebuke. The problem was not the object itself, but the trust placed in it as a spiritual safeguard. The same mindset is seen at the present in the form of lucky charms or jewelry linked to astrology and witchcraft. These may appear harmless, but they reflect the same forbidden search for power outside of God. Bestiality, sexual relations with animals, as listed among the most detestable acts in the Bible. It wasn't only a moral boundary, but was sometimes tied to pagan worship, where such acts were part of fertility rituals. God warned Israel that the nations practicing these things were defiled and that following them would bring the same judgment. The act was treated as an offense against both human dignity and God's created order. While not as common today, it still surfaces in underground circles and in certain extreme forms of occult ritual. By forbidding it, the Bible drew a sharp line between true worship and corrupt practices that degrade the body and dishonor the Creator. Eating blood. The book of Leviticus forbids eating or drinking blood, teaching that life is in the blood and it belongs to God alone. In the ancient world, surrounding nations used blood in their rituals, believing it carried spiritual power. Israel was commanded to stay separate from these practices, and the early church repeated this same instruction in the book of Acts. The warning was not about diet, but about showing respect for life and rejecting pagan customs. Today, the idea still shows up in occult ceremonies where animal blood is consumed, and in certain underground groups that mix blood into initiation rites. Even in popular culture, blood drinking is sometimes glamorized, but Scripture makes it clear that such practices cross a sacred boundary God has set. Mixing fabrics in clothing. Leviticus includes a command not to wear garments woven from two kinds of fabric. At first glance, it may seem minor, but the rule was about separation. Israel's daily life is filled with reminders that they were distinct from the nations around them, and even clothing reflected that calling. Unlike practices such as sorcery or idolatry, this law carried no harsh penalty, showing it was a boundary marker more than a moral crime. While no group today treats blended fabric as spiritually dangerous, it illustrates how God used simple rules to keep His people mindful of holiness in every part of life. Planting different seeds together. Another command was the ban on planting two kinds of seed in the same field. This wasn't about farming techniques, but about symbolism. Just as Israel was not to mix fabrics, even the land they cultivated was to reflect separation and order. Unlike severe offenses such as child sacrifice or witchcraft, this rule carried no death penalty. It served as a daily reminder that God's people were set apart in how they lived and worked. In the present time, farmers freely plant mixed crops without spiritual concern. But the ancient law highlights how even ordinary tasks were used to reinforce Israel's identity as a holy nation distinct from its neighbors. Eating unclean animals. Certain creatures are deemed unclean in the Bible, including pigs, shellfish, and birds of prey. Israel was commanded not to eat them. These food laws taught holiness and reminded God's people that even daily meals were part of covenant life. Some Jewish groups still observe them today through kosher diets, while many Christians believe the restriction no longer applies after the New Testament vision given to Peter. Even so, debates continue among believers, and groups like Seventh-day Adventists still avoid pork and other meats for spiritual reasons. The command was about obedience and not about health trends or personal taste. By steering Israel away from what other nations ate in worship and sacrifice, God marked His people as different. Pagan festivals. In Deuteronomy, Israel was told not to copy the nations by holding feasts or sacrifices at high places, such as hilltop shrines where people honored foreign gods. These sites often combined music and sacrifices meant to gain favor from idols. Even some of Israel's kings allowed them to flourish, and the prophets rebuked the nation for mixing these festivals with worship of the true God. The problem wasn't the celebration itself, but dedicating it to false gods. While the ancient shrines are gone, the pattern continues. Modern pagan groups still mark seasonal festivals like solstices and equinoxes with rituals that echo those old traditions. The warning remains clear. Worship is not to be blended with customs that pull the heart toward idols. Observing times. Some ancient nations believed they could control their future by watching the seasons, reading animal behavior, or interpreting unusual signs in nature. This practice, also called augury, is directly forbidden in the Bible. Instead of trusting God's guidance, people look to patterns and omens to decide when to act. Kings of Israel who dabbled in these methods were condemned for bringing superstition into the nation's worship. While few today speak of augury, the mindset remains. Astrology apps and rituals tied to lunar phases all echo the same belief that timing or chance holds power over life. The Bible warns that such practices offer only false security, leading people away from the one who actually directs time and seasons. Blood oaths and cursed vows. In the book of Jeremiah, the people of Judah swore vows to false gods and bound themselves with curses if they failed to keep them. Such oaths were forbidden because they treated idols as if they held real authority. Even Jesus later warned against swearing by heaven and earth, since truth should not depend on a vow. The problem with these practices is that they gave spiritual weight to powerless beings and opened the door to fear-driven religion. The idea still surfaces in occult initiation rites and secret societies that bind members through curses or oaths. What seems like a show of loyalty becomes dangerous when it invokes spiritual powers apart from God. Failing to include salt in offerings. Every grain offering had to be seasoned with salt, according to the Bible. Salt symbolized permanence and loyalty, so leaving it out meant the sacrifice was incomplete. The command showed that even small details in worship carried meaning. Unlike practices tied to pagan nations, this was an internal reminder to Israel that their covenant with God touched every part of life, down to the offerings on the altar. Salt turned ordinary grain into a sacred act, pointing to faithfulness in the smallest things. Christians may not bring grain sacrifices today, but the principle is timeless. Honoring God is not done halfway, and devotion often shows itself in careful attention to what seems small. Letting hair become unkempt. Priests were not to let their hair become unkempt during service. At first glance, it seems like a minor rule of appearance, but it carried a serious warning. Neglecting this sign of discipline could bring death and God's anger on the whole community. The rule highlighted that priests were set apart, representing holiness before the people, and thus their appearance shows respect in God's presence. Ordinary Israelites weren't bound by this command, but for priests, it reinforced the weight of their role. While Christians no longer follow priestly grooming laws, the principle remains clear. Those who serve God are called to reflect honor and reverence in how they carry themselves. And that wraps up some of the most forbidden practices recorded in the Bible. If this breakdown gave you a clearer look at what Scripture warns against, give it a like, subscribe for more explorations of Christianity's hidden history, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next.